Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
History as it happens, May 23rd, 2024. Defeating democracy, searching for fascism.
Former president is under fire for a video he posted on social media that used language from Nazi Germany.
Seemingly suggests there will be a unified Reich if he wins the 2024 election.
Driven by the creation of a unified Reich.
Vladimir Putin has given several reasons for his invasion of Ukraine.
We will be aiming at demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
At a recent Putin rally, a banner declared for a world without Nazism.
Through their invasion of Ukraine, Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago, repeating the errors of the last century's totalitarian regime.
For every solid analogy, there may be 1,000 bad ones. Both here in the U.S. and in capitals overseas, we can see democracy under pressure. We're told fascism is on the rise. What does it look like when democracy collapses and gives way to fascist dictatorship? Well, maybe we can learn something from Weimar Germany or post-Soviet Russia. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
For the Trump phenomenon, this is perhaps the wrong term. There may be people in the larger Trump camp that actually fall under this category. They want a newborn American nation. And perhaps on 6th of January, some of the insurrectionists had these sort of aims. So I think it's, for the American situation, maybe not such a useful term, and I see actually different threats here.
Let's begin with a really bad analogy. The other day at a conference in Estonia, the Yale historian Timothy Snyder compared Russia's war in Ukraine to the stakes in 1938. That was when Czechoslovakia was dismembered to appease Hitler at the Munich conference, based on the idea that war had been averted. Now, Hitler left the Munich conference, by the way, thinking he'd been robbed of his war. Well, here is Snyder.
Jim, you said that we're about to be in 1939. I'm going to agree with you in a certain way. My comparison would be 1938. This is 1938, but Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight. Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight. So you have an imperfect democracy. It's the furthest democracy east in Europe. It's not perfect. It has various problems. But when threatened by a larger neighbor, it chooses to resist. In that world where Czechoslovakia resists, there's no Second World War. The Czechs had a good army. They could have held the Germans back. It was largely a bluff on the German side. If the Czechs resist, then the French and the British and maybe the Americans eventually start to help. There would have been a conflict, but there wouldn't have been a Second World War. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it was invading Poland with the Czech armaments industry, which was the best in the world. It was invading with Slovak soldiers. It was invading from a geographical position that it only gained because it had destroyed Czechoslovakia. So if the Ukrainians give up, or if we give up Ukraine, then it's a different Russia making war in the future. It's a Russia making war with Ukrainian technology, Ukrainian soldiers, from a different geographical position. Then we're in 1939. We're in 1938 now. In effect, what the Ukrainians are letting us do is they're letting us extend 1938. They're helping us to stay out of 1939. So my answer is no, it's not inevitable. The Ukrainians are giving us this chance, and we have to take this chance if we want to prevent a great power war.
What Snyder said there is one of the most irresponsible and reckless statements I've ever heard any professional historian make. We are not in a 1938 moment. Maybe I'll have more to say about Snyder's propaganda in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com, or you can find me on Substack. I do plan to share in my next newsletter a paper co-authored by the political scientists Stefan Kalitz and Andreas Umland titled Why the Fascists Won't Take Over the Kremlin for Now, a comparison of democracy's breakdown and fascism's rise in Weimar Germany and post-Soviet Russia. This is the analogy we're going to work with today, because I have to admit by now, the fascism stuff is not going away. And for professional historians and political scientists, thinking about the past and present in this manner is what they do. It is human nature to search for answers to our current problems by looking to the past. After all, Weimar Germany was a democracy, a shaky one, yes, that was destroyed by its internal enemies, including many conservative nationalists and elites who were not Nazis. Post-Soviet Russia also experimented with democracy and market economics, but those experiments did not go very well. The 1990s are remembered as a terrible time in Russia, the decade ending with Vladimir Putin in power. Meantime, here in the United States,
what happens after Donald Trump wins? What's next for America?
On Donald Trump's Truth Social platform, that video was shared by someone depicting fictional newspaper articles heralding Trump's victory in November that would bring about a unified Reich. Now, the Trump campaign says a staffer posted the video who did not see the word Reich. Point is, this kind of thing will only fuel the conversation about Trump's alleged fascism. Fascism or not, it is ridiculous. Andreas Umland is a political scientist at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He spends a lot of time in Kyiv, but he joins us now from Stockholm. Our friend Roger Griffin recommended I talk to him about deliberalization and fascism. Andreas Umland, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Anyone that is recommended by Roger Griffin has to be good. So I'm thrilled to have you here. Roger sent me a copy of your working paper about fascism in Russia and some comparative political science there. You know, I had sworn to myself that I was not going to touch the fascism debate again, but here I am. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, how concerned are you about the Russian offensive right now in northern Ukraine?
Yes, it's worrying, and it's especially worrying for cities like Kharkiv that are close to the Russian border. I'm basically every month in Kiev, and Kiev is in a much more comfortable situation. It's also much better protected, and there are a whole number of cities in northeastern and southeastern Ukraine who are now under attack, and they don't have enough air defense, and also that is now a hot topic in the Western Ukrainian relations. So far, Ukraine is not allowed to use its Western weaponry on legitimate Russian state territory. There's now a big discussion, for instance, in Germany, whether Ukraine should be allowed to do so. The signals from Great Britain and also from the US have been that Ukraine can do so. And that is for cities like Kharkiv actually, I think, necessary, because otherwise you cannot protect yourself. Because Russia does not want just to occupy territory. It wants to integrate Ukraine, which it sees as a part of Russia, into its own nation. That is a frightening perspective. It's basically a negation of Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian national culture. All of this should be subdued by Russian national identity and Russian national culture. So this is a very depressing situation for Ukrainians, and it's not also a situation that can be easily resolved via negotiations.
It doesn't mean Ukraine needs to bomb Moscow itself, but if Russian troops and forces are staging on the other side of the line and are going to attack Kharkiv, well, then I think that is fair game. So what attracted you to this subject? You're a political scientist. You've been studying and talking about nationalism and fascism for a long time, longer than many Americans have since the rise of Donald Trump. But maybe you can briefly describe your work for people who are unfamiliar with it.
Well, I'm from Germany, and I was fascinated already as a schoolboy by perestroika and by the changes that were happening after 1985 as a young man, and the perestroika period. And when then the perestroika turned out to be more complicated than one would have thought, the Russian Federation and the other post-Soviet republics went into deep crises. Then what seemed to me became obvious that this is a situation that reminds a lot of the German situation after World War I. this post-imperial new democratic order that is going through deep crises, multiple crises, and that may then also generate similar pathologies. And already in the early 1990s, there was a vibrant neo-fascist scenery in Russia. That was a time when I was quite often in Moscow and in other Russian cities, and I was talking actually to many of these more or less radical nationalists, and some of them clearly fascist. And that was at that time still a minor movement, but it seemed to me already then that this could one day become very dangerous. And now this has actually materialized, and some of the people who were then marginal have now become mainstream, and that makes it not the same as Weimar Germany or fascist Germany. But over the years, there have appeared more and more similarities to the development of interwar Germany.
So how do you define fascism?
I basically use Roger Griffin's definition. I met him 30 years ago in Oxford when I was a student, and I have since used it as simply the most succinct one: palingenetic ultranationalism. That means a revolutionary ultranationalism that wants to initiate a new birth, not just a rebirth, a new birth of the nation. And that is a very good definition in terms of delineating these particular phenomena from other forms of right-wing extremism, ultra-conservative, reactionary, fundamentalist right-wing extremisms. It's simply the most conceptually most logical definition, because definitions are not true or false. They are only more or less useful and more or less coherent, and they sort of have to then to relate also to other concepts and definitions to create a conceptual terminological field with which one can, in a useful way, map the empirical phenomena one has in front of oneself. And so I've written 2 dissertations on 2 Russian fascists, Vladimir Zhirinovsky and Alexander Dugin.
I was going to ask you about Zhirinovsky. I remember him from the 1990s, but go ahead, yeah.
In the 1990s, Zhirinovsky was the leading Russian fascist. Most people saw him as a clown. I met him in 1993 and took an interview with him. I don't think he was just a clown. I think he was Zhirinovsky, but he was also playing Zhirinovsky. He was sort of staging these outbursts, and he was actually in control of himself more so than some people may have thought. And he was also smarter than many people thought. That's also how he managed to stay in Russian high politics throughout the Yeltsin years, the Putin years, the Medvedev years, and he only left Russian politics when he died last year, rather unexpectedly, supposedly of health reasons. And he had a fascist ideology that was very unusual, in that it meant that Russia would be reborn or born anew by a southward expansion. For Russia to become happy and to be soothed, as he put it, Russia had to actually invade Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan and make them parts of the Russian Empire. And this would be the solution for everything for Russia. And Russia would be, through this military operation, this southward expansion, and through this new, completely new territory with new borders, including Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iran, which have not been parts of Russia, become then a reborn nation, a newborn nation, and would then become happy. And that very much fulfilled Griffin's definition, palingenetic ultranationalism.
I love that word, palingenetic, and I often kid around with Roger that no one except him and fellow political scientists, historians, knows what that means. As you say here in your paper, Griffin implies that palingenetic ultranationalism means the idea of an integral nationalist revolution that is understood by the fascists themselves as a rebirth, rejuvenation, or resurrection after a period of the nation's almost fatal decline and degeneration. While clearly being revolutionary, you say, the deeper transformation that fascists aim is for more of a cultural and political rather than economic and social nature. And I agree with that if we're going to understand what makes fascism distinct from other forms of right-wing or left-wing authoritarianism or democracy or just being mean. And what I mean by that, and I do want to get your take on what you think of the discourse here on my side of the Atlantic. People who say Republicans are fascists, Donald Trump is a fascist, we have a fascist movement, are talking about behaviors or characteristics or things they see, like parades or rallies or ugly behavior, that's not necessarily fascism, although it might be the kinds of things fascists would do, like attack the U.S. Capitol to try to overturn the election. You know what I mean?
There are many other evil things in the world, and many people who have been killed have been not killed by fascists. And so that's why I think this definition of Griffin makes sense, because it sort of limits this concept to a particular type of fanatical nationalists. And it's also useful because there's a certain hermeneutic quality to it, in that it sort of makes you, in a way, understand the fascists. They want a newborn nation, and a newborn, to have a new birth, a rebirth, is not necessarily something bad. It's something that I think many of us at some point in their lives want for themselves or for their nation or for their city or for whatever, to have some sort of rebirth. So it's by itself not a pathological wish, but if it then is connected to ultranationalism, to a very exclusive and radical form of nationalism, it then can create these hyper-violent movements that will deport, kill, and put in prison hundreds of thousands of people. So this is also a definition, I think, that helps us better to understand where fascism takes its popularity from.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the big question, of course, of Germany was not that there was Hitler, but why people did followed Hitler, why so many believed in that. And Griffin's conceptualization sort of makes me at least better understand what was behind it.
As Ian Kershaw said, popular dictatorship. But in the Nazi context, the organic community was an exclusive one. Internal enemies had to be, as we know, in the Nazi worldview, eliminated. So what do you make of this debate going on? We're going to talk about Putin and Weimar and post-communist Russia, but what do you think of this debate going on here in my country about fascism?
Yeah, I agree here with people like Griffin that for the Trump phenomenon, this is perhaps the wrong term. There may be people in the larger Trump camp that actually fall under this category. They want a newborn American nation. And perhaps on 6th of January, some of the insurrectionists had these sort of aims. So I think it's, for the American situation, maybe not such a useful term. And I see actually different threats here. What I see is a confrontation between a very sort of progressive form of liberalism and a very reactionary, as I would see it, form of conservatism. And that these two worldviews, they can't go together. And that's why you have this high tension. We have that in Germany, by the way, too. We have now a party, the Alternative for Germany, that is also not a fascist party, but it has a view of German culture and German politics that is simply out of the times that we are living in. And they want to go back to a world that does not exist anymore. But this confrontation, I know Germany simply better than the US, creates enormous tension by itself and can even lead to civil war-like situations, as you had for a short moment in Washington, D.C. on 6th of January. So fascism is, I think, in this connection, the wrong word. The conflict here is another one.
Yeah. Do you believe it's what Roger calls deliberalization? Do you think the United States is going through a period where, I don't want to generalize, there are many aspects to national life. So if I say, is the U.S. deliberalizing, that can mean in every aspect of life, politically, the arts, culture, what have you, right? But do you see deliberalization in my country?
You still have a pluralistic country. It's clearly not, for instance, the deliberalization that has happened in Hungary, where you actually have a state that has become authoritarian, that is not democratic anymore, or it's also incomparable to the kind of deliberalization that has happened in Russia over the last 20 years. So I think it's a better term, definitely, than fascism, but still I would say that the U.S. is still a relatively liberal country. And this liberalism of the U.S. that is still there is, of course, opposed by many people. So there is perhaps the threat of a deliberalization. But anyway, I haven't been to the U.S., I should say, for a long time. So I'm a little bit unsure how it looks right now.
All right. Well, we'll move on to your area of expertise. But I was curious as to what you thought of everything that's going on here. Maybe I'll get you and Roger to visit me one of these years. So, as mentioned, I'd never given the Weimar post-communist Russia comparison a lot of thought. Again, as we try to understand, why do democracies collapse? What are the conditions that can lead to the rise of fascism? I think these are important questions to consider today, given what's going on in Eastern Europe. But, I never really considered Russia under Yeltsin a democracy. Why do you believe 1990s Russia was a democracy, or when was it a democracy? Because it certainly didn't end that decade as a democracy.
Well, it was a semi or proto-democracy, maybe somewhat less democratic than Germany in the 1920s, but there was a genuine multi-party system. There was media pluralism. The elections were important and made sense. They were manipulated. There was a lot of private money floating around in the electoral process, as there is in many proper democracies. So it was a very flawed democratic system, but it was a democratic system largely. The authoritarian traits were already there in the 1990s. The constitution that was adopted in 1993 gave the president a lot of power, and Yeltsin used this power in a different way than Putin did. And even Medvedev, when he was sort of president, I'm saying sort of president because he was not really, in fact, the ruler of Russia. He was occupying this office of president of Russia, but Putin was behind the scene as a prime minister, actually still ruling Russia. But even under Medvedev, when he was president, there was a certain pluralism of opinion. So there is a certain, I would say, on a high abstract level, a certain similarity between post-Soviet Russia and Weimar Germany. Both are post-imperial situations, young democracies or proto-democracies. Both have national minorities outside their borders, and they have many traits of the ancien regime, the old system, still operating in the new, supposedly pluralistic and more liberal and more democratic order. What happened in Russia, though, is we have, with a colleague, Steffen Keilitz from Dresden, we have written about that Russia got an ultra-conservative ruler, as Germany had with Paul von Hindenburg, and who is a representative of the old system, of the pre-democratic or nation-state imperial period. There is a sort of halfway, I would say, similarity between post-Soviet Russia and post-World War I Germany, in that the fascist period, so far at least, has not yet fully kicked in Russia. It's still an authoritarian or totalitarian now system, but it's a system of the past rather than of the future, like the systems of Mussolini and Hitler.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you think Putin is a fascist. I would say no. But there's another question hanging over all of this. Why does it matter?
In Ukraine, where I'm quite often, it matters a lot because that is now the term with which he is described. And I think for Ukrainians, actually, the term, and here perhaps I'm departing from what Roger Griffin would say, the term makes sense because what happens in Ukraine is not fully well described by terms like war, occupation, aggression, expansion, and so on, because in the minds of the Russian perpetrators, this is not a war, an interstate war. This is not an aggression. That is not an occupation. That is a bringing home of Western Russian lands called Ukraine. The problem on these Western Russian lands is that these Western Russians, the Ukrainians, have been infected by a lot of alien, evil ideas like feminism, individualism, liberalism, also fascism, supposedly. And they have to be freed and liberated from these dangerous infections. They have to be, I would say, born anew. Ukrainians have to be born anew as proper Russians. So for the Ukrainians, the experience that they have with the Russian occupation force and with the Russian army is, I would say, in a certain sense, a fascist experience, because there's a foreign power coming to their lands that is trying to initiate a rebirth of these lands that it regards as its own lands, and the Ukrainians as its own, basically, nation, which has, however, been led astray by Western influence and has to be cleansed from it, has to be born anew, has to be reawakened. And for them, I think the term fascism makes sense. It's also, of course, a term that they very well know because they have been occupied by fascist Germany and also by Romania and Italian troops. So they have a direct experience of fascism, whereas many Russians don't have this direct experience. The territory of Russia that was occupied by fascist Germany was much smaller, whereas Ukraine was fully occupied by fascist Germany. So for Ukrainians, this term makes a lot of sense because they experience fascism on their territory, and arguably the policy Russia is trying to implement in Ukraine, a reborn Ukraine that should become again an integral part of the Russian nation.
Yeah, I'm no expert here, but I didn't sense that there was a systematic ideology underpinning Putinism, at least not in the beginning. Maybe now, if we might argue that he's a fascist or not, or that the war in Ukraine is fascistic or has a fascist outlook. But I always thought it was just simple state patriotism, the resurrection of state power, or the revitalization of state power after the terrible 1990s.
If so to say, the territory where you want to implement state patriotism is where the people actually don't think that they belong to your state and that they're not actually Russian patriots, but they're Ukrainian patriots. What do you do then? It's a very paradoxical situation that domestically, clearly, the regime is not fascist because basically things are fine in Russia. Why would you need a palingenetic movement and a nationalist revolution? Russia is okay as it is in Putin's mind. But Western Russia, called Ukraine, is not okay. It has to be reborn as a truly integral part of Russian nationalist territory. And so you have this parallelity of, you could say, ultra-conservative policy inside Russia and a policy in Ukraine that may have to be called fascist. At least the Ukrainians are experiencing.
Yeah, I see your point. And it does seem that Putin is influenced to some degree by new right fascist intellectuals in his country, past and present. But he also bills himself as an anti-fascist, and that has deep roots in Russian history. I mean, the Soviet Union was the army, the Red Armies. They were the ones who destroyed the fascist invaders. Putin as an anti-fascist.
The most vivid expression is, of course, this idea of a denazification of Ukraine that is supposedly necessary, of a country that one should recall has in 2019 elected a Russian-speaking Jew as its president with the best result that Ukrainian presidential candidate ever had in elections, namely 73% in the second round of the 2019 election. And it was no secret that Zelensky is a Jew, and this country now needs to be denazified. Yeah, so this is a very peculiar...
well, has Putin ever defined what that means?
I think the common Russian understanding of Nazism and fascism is being against Russia. The fact that Ukrainians don't want to be Russians and they want their country not to be Russia makes them sort of by definition fascist. That is the easy, simple logic that is behind all of that. And that is, of course, a misuse of the term that reminds one of far older misuses of the term when, for instance, Stalin called the Social Democrats in Western Europe social fascists. Yeah, although they were killed by the fascists, the Social Democrats, but he still maintained that these Social Democrats who were put in concentration camps and killed by the thousands by the German Nazis were allegedly social fascists. Or I myself, I grew up in East Germany. I lived behind what was called the Antifaschistischer Schutzwall, the anti-fascist protection wall, which was the border between East and West Germany. And we were supposedly protected from West German fascism by this wall, although our system in East Germany was much more in the way it was organized, much closer to the historical fascist regimes than the West German
the Stasi
socio-political system.
Yes, the Stasi, the secret police in East Germany, very much like a Gestapo.
which had certain similarities. It was no equivalent of the Gestapo, of course, but it was a political police, clearly, and it was a rather harsh political police that was infiltrating society. So this is a well-entrenched, well-developed, if you like, misuse of the term fascism or Nazism. And that's why now this whole war of expansion a war of suppression and of genocide, I would even say that Russia is now conducting is understood, not only presented by Putin, but also understood by many, if not most Russians, as indeed an anti-fascist operation, that this is something good. The poor Ukrainians will now finally be brought back to their true identity, namely their Russian identity, and these lands, Western Russian, Ukrainian lands, will be liberated from Nazi ideology, as many Russians unfortunately see it.
Or as Dick Cheney put it in 2003, they'll greet us as liberators. So what are the conditions for democratic collapse / rise of fascism? In our country, my country rather, I don't see the conditions for the rise of fascism. I don't really see conditions for democratic collapse, despite all the problems we're having right now. I don't think that means collapse. One possible condition that you take up in your paper in the context of Weimar, two conditions that you take up in the context of Weimar and post-communist Russia. One was economic duress. We can talk about that. And the other was the fact that democracy didn't have deep roots. We're not talking about, liberal traditions in either of these places. And democracy, especially in Weimar Germany, had plenty of enemies who were trying to destroy it before Hitler came along. Why don't we go with the economics first?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very simple thesis. In fact, obviously, this was the biggest factor in the rise of the German fascist party that existed already in the 1920s, but got only high electoral support in the early 1930s. And it was also a factor that, for instance, led to Zhirinovsky winning the first post-Soviet parliamentary multi-party elections in Russia in 1993, when Zhirinovsky's party came with almost 23%, gained the first place. It's not a sufficient condition, of course, for the rise of fascism. Actually,
the Nazis had a lot of middle-class supporters, and the communists attracted a lot of out-of-work people. But go ahead, yeah.
The research that I know is actually rather ambivalent about the social stratum that is supportive of fascism, because there have been, in different studies, been different conclusions saying to me that there's no clearly pro-fascist social stratum, the middle class or the working class or the unemployed or the upper class or something like that, that you can have supporters of fascism in all social strata. What has been a commonality in some of the rises of the fascist movements is a prominent role that students played in the initial phases of the emergence of fascist movements. Rather discomforting to me, at least, as I'm working in universities most of my life. But that is something that has been found to be, for instance, very important in Germany in the 1920s, where fascist ideas gained a lot of traction among students. But the rise of fascism is a much more complicated thing than just economic duress and also democratic failure. It's pretty well described, actually, in Griffin's books, The Nature of Fascism or Modernism and Fascism, where he explains why many people then come to embrace this idea of a newborn nation, that you need to have actually a deep nationalist revolution, creating a new human being as a result of this revolution, because people are disenchanted with the liberal modern world, and they also acknowledge that they cannot return to the old pre-liberal world. So what they want to create is an alternative modernity, and a non-liberal and illiberal, anti-liberal modernity, which then leads them to support fascist parties.
Yeah.
I would actually point back to Roger and to other comparativists of fascism who have sort of looked at these movements in many countries. I've looked mostly on Russia and a little bit on Ukraine and interwar Germany. My knowledge, frankly, on comparative fascist studies is limited.
Well, fascism was an interwar phenomena in Europe. However, no one knows they're living in an interwar period at the time, because it can't be called such until the Second War begins. In this case, it would have been 1939. But I agree with you. It's too easy to say that the Great Depression happens and then the unemployed flock to the Nazi banner. Now, the economic duress during Weimar Germany was an important factor in the rise of extremist parties, including the Nazis, on both the right and left. There are a lot of things going on there that really don't apply to, well, I can't say for sure what's going on in your neck of the woods. I'm not an expert on Europe. But I live here in the United States, and I don't see many similarities, or the similarities that I do see are superficial between our problems here today in 2024 with Trump, etc., and Weimar Germany, which, as mentioned, did not have deep democratic roots, had the humiliation of loss in a major war with millions dead. And obviously the Nazis and others used that as a propaganda tool to restore lost empire. So you had the Great Depression, you had defeat in World War I, you had a lot of upheaval in Germany during those years as well. But as Zara Steiner has pointed out in her great work, there was a period of time there in the 1920s where Weimar Germany enjoyed a period of relative stability, and it was a fairly liberal place. And Steiner says there was no inevitability about what was going to come. I don't know if we can apply that at all to what's going on today.
Indeed, I mean, I don't think that fascism was inevitable. Even with the Great Depression hitting Germany, which fed then, of course, fascist tendencies, not just the Nazi movement, but also other fascist tendencies, for instance, an intellectual movement called the Conservative Revolution. Even Hitler's coming to power was almost an accidental event, and Hitler never actually won in an absolute majority in free elections. And he was made chancellor when his party was already in decline, was still the strongest party in Germany, but it was declining. And it was a failure, as many theorists of fascism argue, of the old conservative elites that decided at some point to make common course, to go together with the fascists, and then lost basically their own power to the fascists. The old elites play here a crucial role, and they didn't pass the test, so to say, in Germany. But it didn't have to happen this way. It was obviously something that was very much determined exactly by this experience of enormous liberalization in the 1920s, and then this new democratic and liberal and open society that had emerged in the 1920s experienced this deep crisis during the Depression. And that signified then to many people that liberalism and openness and pluralism and an open society is not good for Germany, and that it needs a newborn nation, a new totalitarian system that would not repeat the old Reich, the old empire, because the old empire was also unsuccessful. So the fascists then promised a new empire. And something similar is now also observable in Russia, that you have the representatives of the old empire, the Soviet Union, including Putin, who want to restore, at least partly, the Soviet empire and partly the Tsarist empire. And then you have also a lot of people who want to create a new empire. Alexander Dugin is perhaps the most prominent one, recently interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who does not want to recreate the Soviet Union or the Tsarist empire. He wants Russia to be a new civilization, a new empire with completely new people, with completely new culture.
Yeah, I don't see Putin being interested in Marxist Leninism and restoring communism at all. But Putin's case is interesting because he straddles both eras. I don't see him as a post-Soviet leader insofar that his experience was the fall of the Soviet Union as a member of the KGB. He saw that as a catastrophe, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So he doesn't want to restore communism, but he does remember the days when Russia was a superpower. It was the Soviet Union then. I see Vladimir Zelensky as being a post-Soviet new generation of leader. You say here in your paper that the main problem for Democrats, lowercase d Democrats, in Russia after 1991 was that they were not willing or able to present themselves as rooted in Russian history. And then you say in Russia, Democrats suffered from a disconnect from the population at large. Many Russians said, you know what, this experiment is not for us. This did not work. And we can wrap up with this, Andreas. I don't see how Russia, especially under Putin, but even after him, will try to revert back, if that's the right way of putting it, to democracy. I'm not an expert on Russia's internal politics, but I don't see a calling even among the people for a return to that experiment from the 1990s.
It's now, of course, very, very difficult to speculate because the situation has become so much worse, not just in terms of the war, but also in terms of the domestic radicalization of the regime, and it may radicalize even further. On the other hand, I wouldn't exclude also on the basis of the experience of Germany that at one point the Russians may come back to democracy, and they may actually come to a point where they may remember the 1990s in different ways than today. There is a comparatively free country with an open future. And there will be then also already some sort of democratic experience that people will remember from the 1990s, and which will make then this second democratization or third democratization. The first one was actually after the February Revolution in 1917. Okay. If we then have a second or third republic, there could be a democratization, maybe first a democratization by default, a concept introduced by a colleague of mine in Canada, Lucan Wei, who argues that for certain countries, democracy is then the only possible, so to say, solution for domestic problems, although you may not have actually a vibrant civil society, a well-developed party system, lots of democratic sentiment in the population. They may still become democracies by default, because that's the only way to resolve domestic conflict and to keep the country together. So something like that, perhaps in a different period, may happen.
That's a good point. My comments about Russia, I was thinking of the economic calamities that took place in the 1990s, which I'm not even sure can be called market reforms. I mean, this wasn't capitalism per se. It was oligarchy and theft, really, right? But ordinary Russians lost everything. They lost their savings, and it was a terrible time. But to your point, there were some good memories from that period, especially starting in the late Gorbachev period. A flowering of artistic freedom, and dissidents could publish their tracts, and there was an attempt at multi-party pluralism. It was just getting started during that time. And a free press. Gorbachev allowed newspapers to criticize him. Maybe people would want to return to something like that rather than the autocracy that they're living under now.
And especially if the current regime, if this path that Putin has now taken will be discredited. And the major test here for the system has now the war become. And that's why this war is not only important for Ukraine and for Europe, but also for Russia. I think war will be also crucial for the future of this regime. Not just of Putin's rule by himself, but also of this regime that he has created.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, Iran's president is dead, killed in a helicopter crash. What does it mean for Iran's politics and its relationships with its neighbors, its proxies, and the United States? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out Pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.